most prominently increased transparency and efficiency. But in looking at determining how the functions of the Commission will work and to draw upon the elements that we believe are of particular relevance to people from a migrant background, we feel that the coordinating and compiling and maintaining of the electoral register role will provide welcome oversight to the process and, as my colleague said, reform to the process in some regards, but also not just in administrative terms, but in promoting the registration process to migrant communities. The adoption of our promotion of education and awareness functions is a key and needed role when it comes to the functions of the Commission. While we realise that there are some cost implications in this, we also would be of the position that the long-term implications of a failure to inform and enfranchise migrant communities as to their voting rights and potential is a greater cost in societal terms as well as financial. In terms of the oversight of voting stations, we believe that the Commission needs to play a role in terms of the training and issuing of guidelines to local staff administering voting at polling stations. This is of particular relevance to relation to migrant voters, as at every election or every voting opportunity, small numbers of isolated incidents arise where people from a migrant background are occasionally subject to inappropriate comments at polling stations or inappropriate insinuations as to their ability to vote or not, or their citizenship or not, sometimes based on skin colour. They are isolated incidents, but for us it shows a need for clearer training and clearer guidelines at polling stations. Lastly, we believe that the Commission can play an important role in researching, either in its own capacity or through partnership with organisations such as the ESRI, the CSO, NGOs who work in the area, or academic institutions, looking at the voting registration and overall voting trends in Ireland. And from our perspective, including those of migrants, we feel there is a dearth of information and data in that area that we feel exists in other areas, and is very crucial information to have to inform what the voting trends or voting interests of people from a migrant background are. Other countries and electoral commissions have taken on similar tasks. In Australia, the Commission there is explicitly responsible for promoting public awareness and for conducting education and information sessions. It participates in community and multicultural events, and even goes as far as providing some language support in classes. Between 2009 and 2011, of 152 community events that were staged, 98 were targeted towards migrant communities, which we be able to position shows a very strong kind of reach out to migrant communities. These and additional efforts in Australia have resulted in massive increase in migrant voter registrations, numbering into the hundreds of thousands. In the UK, the Electoral Commission there monitors trends in relation to voter registration and does regular surveys and research within the UK's black and ethnic minority communities, which we feel is a crucial role as well. In summary, a comprehensive plan and central management function is needed, not just in relation to voting processes for migrant communities, but overall. It is our position that the Commission must take on this role not only in an administrative or oversight capacity, but in education, training, promotion and research capacity. Ample opportunity exists, we believe, in such things as the very positive spectacle of citizenship ceremonies, which at the moment include information about voter registration, but we believe have the potential to go further than that, because in our experience, information is one thing, but actually reaching out to communities and meeting them face to face, explaining things to them, even having translation services and ability to assist people in filling out forms, is that crucial extra step that's needed to get people to register and to cross the line into that political participation. We're very happy to provide any further information or assistance we can, and again welcome the opportunity to speak before you this afternoon.
Thank you, Mr. Killorn. Mr. McLaughlin-Byrne.
Thank you, Gaeltacht, and thank you to the committee for having me in. My name's Donal McLaughlin-Byrne. By way of introduction, until last week I was president of Trinity College Dublin Students' Union, and over the course of the last year I acquired more experience with the voter registration process in Ireland than I ever thought I would. Unsurprisingly, yes, I echo the recommendations by previous speakers to set up an electoral commission, and I would argue that, unsurprisingly again, that significant improvement of the way we register people to vote in this country is needed. So I don't know if you've all had access to this paper, but I'm just going to speak through this paper which I wrote last week because it sets out most of what I think on the process. But I will say that I'm speaking obviously in a personal capacity of someone who's interested in the democratic process, but also as a young person and of course a student too. Obviously, as a bit of context, this year was an exceptionally positive year for students and for young people, and for many it was the first time we'd engaged collectively in the democratic process. I propose that there are two reasons why this level of civic engagement might not necessarily transfer into the future and into future elections, and that's something that I've read a few articles about. How can we transfer this energy? There are two reasons why I fear that might not happen unless we capitalise on the energy rather than just let it dissipate. Firstly, as a previous speaker said, young people are very mobile. And USI has said prominently, we registered 27,000 people to vote this year. But I would reiterate that those 27,000 people will mostly move house before the next election. A lot of students move house every single year, so a highly mobile group of people. And secondly, the referendum that just happened on marriage equality was a very obviously binary civil rights issue, which was very easy to resonate with people. And the same, unfortunately, can't be said of general elections. So I would say that we need to spur ourselves on here. So I lay out 7 problems, just by way, so I'm obviously speaking from the capacity of someone who's interested in voter registration. Obviously, if an electoral commission were set up, it would have a lot of other responsibilities. But I'll talk through briefly some problems which exist with respect to voter registration. So the first problem is that the system in practice is currently entirely decentralised, and there are gaping differences between the system on paper and the system on the ground. In theory, having a decentralised, devolved system has advantages. So it gives the people with local expertise the responsibility to pick the polling stations and to go door to door. But the fact is that doesn't happen. There are serious problems. So, for example, in theory, a decentralised system prevents double voting. So someone casting a vote in Dublin and then getting a bus home to Bray, where I live, and casting another. But the fact is, unless a council happens to pick up the phone and ring Wicklow County Council and say, is there a guy called Donald McLaughlin-Byrne on your register, that is not going to, there's no way to prevent double voting. So the decentralised nature of the system seriously potentiates manipulation of the system rather than averting it. The second problem is that the available information is confusing, it's contradictory on many different resources, and it deters non-traditional voters. And non-traditional voters obviously refer to the people who are represented on this committee today. So I was on the phone to someone from one of the county councils, and I was told, I asked the question, what if someone, not only is, let's say someone's poorly literate, let's say someone's homeless, let's say someone is too busy with financial or personal pressures, or let's say someone just isn't interested in reading the dense prose that currently you have to traverse to go through the guidelines, you are excluded. I think the ideal with respect to the information available to people on how to get registered would be that it has the user in mind. So, for example, just before this session, on my phone outside, I went about halfway through the process to register to vote in the UK on my phone. And it said, what would you like to do? Would you like to register to vote? Would you like to read about this? And currently, the information that's available is very inward-facing. The third problem that I saw was that the primary RFA form which we use to register people to vote, it pertains to households and not to individuals. And this is a serious problem. So as a previous speaker said, the current system was designed when the vast majority of people in this country lived in the same place for their whole lives, and there was an assumed family structure. This doesn't apply to students. So for example, at the start of this year in October, we did some door-to-door registration in Trinity Halls in Dartry in Rathmines. And there are 42 people living in one address in Cunningham House, Trinity Hall, Dartry. And there are 6 spaces on the RFA form. So one of the people asked me the question, how are we all going to fit on the same form? And they couldn't. So it doesn't work thinking in terms of households rather than in terms of individuals. It doesn't represent the change that has happened in recent decades in Ireland. Actually, briefly, if I have the time, bizarre problems can arise with the current RFA form that you might not necessarily consider. Let's say, the example I use in my document, let's say John and Mary live in the same house, and John is going to vote yes, and Mary is going to vote no. John could go down to, could print off an RFA form, could say John Murphy, 1 Main Street, and send it off. Mary could then print off the same form and write Mary, 1 Main Street, and omit John's name. If the current system is applied strictly, the council will receive that form in the post and will say, oh, obviously John has moved out of 1 Main Street and Mary has moved in. So in theory, someone who knows that they're going to vote a different way to someone who lives with them could actually manipulate the system in that way as well. Fourth problem is that checktheregister.ie doesn't work, unfortunately. If you are cursed with a fodder or a hyphen or a double barrel name, all of which I'm cursed with, it doesn't work. Unless you input your details precisely as the person in the county council inputted them, you won't come up. And to be honest, this year when people would come to me on an almost daily basis saying, am I in the register? I'm not sure, I vaguely remember you guys registering me. I would advise them not to use check the register, because more often than not it's misleading. The only way really to have a definitive answer is to go to your local library or to ring up your franchise section of your council. And I think the overall problem with the website is obviously the local annoyances, but the fact that it's no one's express responsibility. It's nobody's express responsibility to maintain a decent online modality. The next problem is that there's no clarity regarding the dates of referendums. Okay, so in fact, all of the student registration efforts this year were predicated on 2 assumptions: that the 2 referendums would happen on a weekday, and that the 2 referendums would happen before the end of the academic year. One of those assumptions was correct. It happened on a Friday. But unfortunately, by May 22nd this year, the vast majority of students had already gone home to Donegal, to wherever. And so they had been registered to vote in Dublin and now either had to change their vote through a cumbersome process or get a bus down, which many people didn't, despite the high turnout. So the lack of clarity, someone even said to me the other day, there's a Constitution Day idea that someone had to have a date when referendums happen. The fact there's no clarity regarding the dates of referendums is a problem you could easily, that could go unnoticed. My second last problem is that the postal vote system in Ireland is obsolete. Okay, the process is so cumbersome that I would love to know figures as to how many successful postal votes were processed this year in Ireland. 7 students managed to get almost all the way through the process because we helped them. But as far as I'm aware, not one Trinity student, from my perspective, actually managed successfully to register for a postal vote. And on this, there was this home to vote Twitter thing that was trending, where there were these inspiring images of people flying home from Australia and China and all these different places to vote. That's obviously inspiring, but surely also it's totally unnecessary and inefficient. And the fact that there's no outlet for citizens abroad to vote is bizarre, particularly in the context of the recent emigration that's happened over the last decade. The final problem, and the overarching problem with the current voter registration system, is that it's no one body's express responsibility. So on several occasions I was asserted that when I was asking questions about how to register someone, what's the right form, I was asserted that, you know, registering people to vote isn't the students' union responsibility. And I would ask, whose responsibility is it? But the fact is, it's actually no one body's express responsibility to register people to vote. So, you know, in Scotland, for the independence referendum, there was 85% turnout and 98% voter registration. If tomorrow every single Irish citizen who is not registered simultaneously became civically engaged and sent off a registration form. The current system does not have the capacity to handle that. So that's a serious problem, and as previous speakers said, that we simply don't invest as much as we should in these matters. So I'll wind up my remarks there. Obviously, I haven't included things like votes at 16. I haven't included the difficulties with constituencies and finding out your polling station. But broadly, those are the problems. And thanks again for having me in, and I'd welcome any questions on what I've said.
Thank you very much indeed, Donald. Okay, we're going to bring in Deputy Stanley. So 10 minutes. After the 10 minutes are up, whoever's in possession ceases speaking.
Thanks, Gaeltacht, and thanks to the panel for coming in and sharing your thoughts and your views in relation to this important matter with us. On the issue of the voting age, I would have brought forward a bill to the Dáil to reduce the voting age to 16. Because we would feel, the party I represent, Sinn Féin, would feel that young people would, that should be included. And indeed, we looked very carefully at what happened in Scotland recently, which hasn't been extended, as I understand it, to general elections in Britain, but hopefully will be. One of the issues that the panel might give me to views on, maybe Anya O'Donnell might, is just in relation to engaging young people. And I think the point that you made is very well made in relation to, you don't wake up on your 18th birthday turned on, right? Here we go, I'm going to civically engage. I can't remember waking up like that, anyway, that's for sure, on my 18th birthday. But one of the difficulties, I think, is that at second level, there's a kind of a superficial attempt to a second level education to engage young people, or there's some kind of civic education and political education in the school. But one of the interesting things about it is this: I'm a public representative for 16 years, and at various times over the 16 years, from my own children and from other children, young people attending second level, they would tell me that there was people in talking to them about engaging in the political process and talking to them about politics from other political parties. I have never been asked, and I don't think too many of my colleagues have been asked. And I just think, I'm not saying that we have anything, that we should be any different than any of the rest of them, but the difference is that we don't actually be asked. And I just find that curious, and if the panel got any views on that, because surely if, like we would be seen, I suppose, to be the left or centre of politics, surely, if it's just centrist parties that were being asked in, or centre-right parties were being asked in, surely one of the things that encourage young people to engage would be to actually hear some different views, and that there would be some debate around that. And I would just be interested in hearing the panel's views on that. Would that help? And, should it be the case maybe that schools should invite, a broader range of political opinion into address young people? But I find that curious, and it tends to be, when I did try to check out this a few times, I discovered that it was basically down to, you didn't really get a straight answer, but in the grapevine you could hear it, that it can come down maybe to the preference, the political allegiance of the principal or the person, the teacher of the class, which is interesting. Just in relation to the, I think trying to get young people to think about politics, I think that it has to happen, and before 16 even, that trying to get that kind of discussion going, and the relevance of politics, and how politics affects young people's lives. And I think probably the starting point is local government, but just maybe you might just give some views on that. Ian mentioned in relation to the the number of young people that registered in the recent referendum, which was brilliant, and the engagement and the turnout, fantastic, regardless of which way they voted. Just wondering, what can be done to try and sustain that? I mean, you mentioned some of the problems to sustain that, going forward, because when that was on one issue, people will very soon vote, to elect people to attend this House, 158 people to attend the Dáil, who will, for the 5 years after that, deal with a whole range of issues equally as important and make the decision on behalf of the electorate. Right now, I know that's a bit more convoluted because, you know, the referendum is direct democracy, right? People voting for, you know, gay marriage or voting against gay marriage, whereas, you know, you're electing some of us here to come here and make a decision on your behalf or try and represent your views, but just how we might try and carry that over into the general election and indeed future county council elections and city council elections. In relation to the spend, it's interesting reading your paper earlier on in relation to Ian's paper, the New Zealand spending 2.5 or 3 times more on the Electoral Commission than we spend here on the electoral process. How should it be? How should it be spent? Maybe it just might. Is there one? I know there's probably a whole range of things, but maybe one specific thing that would stand out that we need to spend it on. And the vexed question of dealt with at length by Donald in relation to, you know, household registration. You know, I came across a house where there was 7 people registered, but 2 people lived there. You know, and there's a lot of stories about that around the country. And it's not, you know, it's not confined to any one area. It happens in a number of places. But you know, and we all should have an interest in trying to stamp that out. But what system should we replace it with? I mean, we've discussed this before, and I would discussed it many times in the chamber and outside the chamber with the previous Minister for the Environment, Phil Hogan. And you know, the PPS number is one that our party would have suggested. You know, the system in the north as well, the rolling registration process, the open registration process, that you don't have it closed. You know, it doesn't close like it does here. You know, would that suffice maybe in place of the current system without going to individual registration? Because one of the problems that was highlighted to me was that there's something like 6.5 million PPS numbers issued. Now, that can be explained by people who are in the graveyard, people who have gone back to Poland, Irish people who are now in New Zealand or in Canada or Australia or whatever else. And the last question I would like to ask is the panel maybe to give a view on is that there has been recommendation in relation to citizens in the 6 counties being allowed to vote in presidential or in Senate elections. And there's been some suggestion from maybe having a separate panel of people for the, you know, from the north, you know, where people from the north could have some voice, because we've had people there in the past, such as Seamus Mallon, if I remember correctly, Senator Gordon Wilson, different people, you know, from the north, maybe who had, you know, something useful to say and had important things to say. And I just think that you know, that section of our citizenry, despite the fact that, you know, they're constitutionally they're Irish citizens, what would be the views of the panel on that question? Yeah, the Constitutional Convention, that's where their recommendation was recommendations on that in relation to being able to vote as well for Uachtaráin there. And we've had Mary McAleese, very good president, Michael D, very, very good president as well. But you know, if we did have, I think the fact that Mary McAleese couldn't vote for herself, or her family couldn't vote for her, I think it was you know, it shows that things are skewed a little bit. But just you might give a view on that.
That was nearly 8 minutes, so I'm going to ask, because you mentioned a couple of issues that Mr. Power rose, so I'm going to Mr. Power first.
Sure. Just in relation to how the money in New Zealand is spent, so the majority of the budget, they have 25 permanent staff. The majority of the budget is related to enrolment services, so they outsource the updating of the electoral register to the postal service in New Zealand. But the 25 permanent staff makes up 1/3 of their budget as well. It's around kind of 6 million. From our perspective, what we would see happening here is that the government, the Electoral Commission would invest a sizable portion of their budget in information technology and looking to streamline the process of registration online. And even if that were to be, for a start, the uploading of scanned documents, even for instance, online, so that people can get the form, fill it out and upload it, which is what the New Zealand Electoral Commission do for actually citizens abroad. So that's one of the innovations that's available. But but they also in New Zealand have something called RealMe, which is where you can verify your identity online for a range of public services. So we currently don't have that, but it has to start somewhere, and potentially it's through the Electoral Commission that we start that process of being able to verify your identity online for use of in a variety of different ways for public services. Secondly, in terms of the spend, we would see a huge spend needed on engagement with marginalised or vulnerable groups, or target groups, I should say, particularly young people, and also people who are coming from maybe migrant communities, as my colleague said earlier. In terms of sustaining the marriage referendum, I guess, as my colleague from Trinity Students' Union said, it's hard to assess, given that the referendum was about an issue which people could connect to their lives, and that potentially differentiated from previous referendums which were about Oireachtas inquiries and judges' pay, things that aren't particularly interesting or relevant to young people. And I guess from a politician's perspective, it's going to be, the challenge is going to be basically to relate to young people, to speak to their issues and to understand what it is that they are concerned about and go about addressing those concerns, and ensuring the promises are kept once elections pass. I think that's something that's very important to young people. And just finally, the National Youth Council have done a huge amount of work on Vote at 16, and we would very much support the idea that young people get involved in the civic process earlier. We would view, CSP as quite a superficial treatment of civic education, and to be able to engage at 16, there's no argument against it really, in terms of why young people shouldn't at 16 be able to become engaged in the civic process. So, thank you.
Okay. Mr. Gaeltacht, do you want to say something in response to those issues before we move on?
Sure. So your question on the households, obviously my opening remarks, because of time, I did what you're not supposed to do and gave problems with no solutions. But the solutions, I think, to the problem, there's a few of them. So first, I think the ideal one is the most obvious one, which is automatic registration. I actually have never heard a good reason why you shouldn't automatically be added to a voter an electoral register when you turn 18 or 16, whatever the case may be. I was told at the start of the year, voting's very important, implying that you should almost have to jump through a few hoops to merit a vote. But, paying taxes is very important as well, and I didn't have to sign up to that. So I've never heard a reason why automatic registration doesn't work. If that for some reason isn't viable, I think online voter registration would make a lot of sense, and would remove the problem of dead people and people who don't live in a house anymore being registered. So as I say, just before the session, I registered to vote in the UK over the course of about 5 minutes. Well, I nearly registered to vote in the UK. So online voter registration. And the third, absolute baseline solution would be to have an individual-centric system rather than where you live, who you live with, the individual. And I think an online centralised register makes so much sense. I can't believe it hasn't already existed. So that would prevent double voting if everyone at every polling station had access to the same online database. And also it alludes, surprisingly, subtly, it alludes to your question about spending. So obviously anything that requires money, people aren't going to jump at. But the fact is, there are so many changes that could be made which would improve the efficiency of the process and actually remove or reduce the number of man hours required. So for example, this year, if I have time, a number of the local councils don't accept forms in bulk, okay? So that means that you have to have one form in one envelope. Some do and some don't. But there's one council, so Dublin City Council doesn't accept forms in bulk, which means I had to enlist 10 SU colleagues to spend a full day packing envelopes, 1,500 envelopes, and to send them off in the post, where presumably Dublin City Council had to spend a full day opening them. So the rigidity and the laboriousness of the current system would actually reduce the need for money and for the amount of resource that's needed at the moment. But certainly with the households, with the problem, it's just there's so many solutions to that.
Yeah, just you might finish up on this, Deputy. Thanks.
Just in relation to the point I said about you know, does the panel feel it's important that young people are exposed to various different political views, left, right, centre, you know? That's it.
Open this, please, Donald. Thank you.
Sure, yeah. So I think that actually alludes to the question of how we're going to transfer the energy from this referendum to future issues, where this was obviously very direct, very tangible. People don't connect the same way with political parties. I think a very basic one would be some explanation in schooling and education on information websites of what political stances actually mean. So this party has this stance on this issue. Did you know that? This party has this stance on this issue. This is what left means, this is what centre means, this is what right means. I think a lot of people vote for who their parents vote for. They vote for the nicest looking poster. People don't really get, I think, and I wouldn't be an ignoramus, but only this year did I get a real comprehension of what stances mean, what left means, what centre left means. So I think some kind of resource that's impartial, that says this is what, if you believe in this and this and this and this, you should vote for a left-leaning party. If you believe in this and this and this, you should vote for whatever else. I think some kind of resource.
Thank you, Don. Deputy McLaughlin.
Thanks very much indeed, Chairman, and you're very, very welcome. It's interesting to hear the comments, because over the last number of weeks we've been listening to some of the experts in relation to going forward with the Electoral Commission, and you're quite right, Donald, I suppose, in relation to the recent marriage equality referendum. I think 28,000. I met with the Union of Students of Ireland there recently, and they informed me that there was 28,000. But this was an issue that you know, resonated with a lot of people that may not come the next general election or the next local elections, and that is an issue to get more young people involved to vote and to be interested in that, because only recently there I met with a group of young people in Sligo, and I see a submission in from them there from the Youth Cafe in Sligo in relation to young people, and they wouldn't be prepared, say, at 15 years of age. We talked about 16 years of age as well in relation to reducing the age. Also that young people do not have the maturity, and this is what was felt by some of them, that they were frustrated by, I suppose, young people, and some of them felt that they wouldn't be interested in voting. So I mean, how do we overcome this? Even this is, you know what I mean. You have many other organisations like Colin and Og, you have Dawn and Og, and various other people that are being informed of what's happening, but it's very, very hard to get people engaged and get them involved in politics. As politicians, I suppose the most frustrating thing for us is, come election time, people are not registered, and I think that the consensus there over the last couple of weeks was perhaps maybe the way forward was, for a starter, was every person, the PPS number to be used as a starting, perhaps maybe. And I'd just like to hear your views on that, because I know that you have expressed the concerns, and that's the concerns of every politician. You go to a house, the person isn't registered, you get them on the register by having them to fill out these forms. It's very cumbersome. It goes to the local authorities, the guard has to sign the form, then it goes to the local authorities, and it's on maybe the draft register for the next election and that type of thing. So it is a very, very slow and very cumbersome way of getting people registered on the vote. And I'm sure particularly for young people, and as you said, mentioned in relation to students and people all over the country, they're maybe engaged in college activities during the week, and by the time an election is called, perhaps maybe on a Friday or whatever else, they're either heading home for one commitment or another. That it's very, very difficult. Whether we'd consider, as in other European countries worldwide, and that you know, you have elections on weekends, on Sundays, or at a weekend. I don't know what your views or whatever else on that, but I'd just like to, just interested to hear what you have already said from the various submissions. Thank you.
Thank you. Who are you directing those questions to, Deputy?
I think both Ian and perhaps maybe Donald and maybe Anne, in relation to the young, you referred earlier, and to the younger voters.
Okay.
So we'll endeavour to bring the other witnesses in at the next round of questioning. Ian, kick off.
Yeah, sure. I think really the main issue in relation to your frustration at people not being registered is the fact that it's not owned by anybody, so it's nobody's job to get people registered. 50,000 plus young people turn 18 every year, and it's nobody's job to ensure that those 50,000 young people are registered. It's their job, but they're not necessarily made aware of the necessity to, and also the process to register. Similarly, as we said as well, because the register is closed every year at a particular point, it doesn't allow young people who turn 18 in the intervening period to register easily, particularly if there's an election or a referendum called. It means that they need to get the signature of a Garda, which is quite a cumbersome and potentially intimidating process as well for a young person to have to go through in order to just simply to register to vote. Online registration will have a huge impact in terms of the registration of young people. It will make it simple for a generation of young people who are digitally native and for whom doing things online is the norm, and for whom many anecdotally during the marriage referendum campaign were just it was their first time engaging with the system and just couldn't believe that you couldn't register online. I think that was definitely something that was expressed. And finally, if a vote is to take place during term time, then a Saturday is ideal for young people, particularly students who may need to travel back to wherever they live or wherever their vote is assigned to. But given if we had online registration where you could change your address easily, then they could change their address to somewhere that was close to their place of learning as well. So I think there's many different things to consider, but basically, ultimately, a simplification of the process is what's going to address it.
Okay, Brian Killeorn and then Donald.
I just wanted to add a little bit, a kind of a caveat around kind of automatic registration as regards it shouldn't make the assumption, I suppose, that everybody is a citizen, whereas you don't have to be a citizen to vote in certain, of course, local and European elections. You also don't have to be a citizen to get a PPS number. There are lots of different people who can get PPS numbers. So in looking at things like automatic registration or a similar model of it, I think it would need to be backed up, as Ian said, by a very fluid way of amending the information so that you can opt into saying what your nationality is or citizenship is, and therefore what your voting rights are attached to that. And that can change then, of course, if somebody becomes a citizen of the state. So if there is a more fluid way of registering, which is absolutely needed, it needs to take into account that not everybody voting is a citizen. That's the only thing I would just add as well.
Okay, Donald.
Okay. So the first question about how to transmit the energy that was generated this year, I think obviously having an online modality is very obvious and very urgent, and I would echo there was absolute bafflement that it couldn't be done online. It just makes very little sense for someone who's digitally native. The Electoral Act was written before I was born. It was written before the advent of the internet. It was written before third level education levels ballooned as they have over the last 2 decades. So we need to update our system to reflect the times. The second question you asked about the dates of referendums, I think there are pros and cons to having it on a Saturday or a Friday. For example, on a Saturday, a lot of people would go home. If they're in Trinity, I would, for example, go home for the weekend to work, and I only live in Wicklow, but I think the key is consistency. So saying the referendum is going to be on a Friday. Be there, be where you need to be. And just as a throwaway remark, I think it's strange that you shouldn't, if you had an online centralised register, you could vote anywhere. I obviously there are issues to tease out, but I think it's strange that you can't just walk into a polling station with your passport and say, my name's Donald, I'm an Irish citizen, can I vote here? This thing of this mass exodus of people back home, it reminded me of Herod's census in the Bible, and surely there's got to be a more efficient way of having thousands of people moving around the country on referendum day. But maybe that's a little bit not that feasible. But the key with dates is certainly consistency.
Okay, Deputy Conan and Senator Keane.
First of all, my apologies for being late and missing the presentation. And secondly, I want to avail of the opportunity while I welcome all our guests here this afternoon to brief us. I want a particular welcome to my neighbour and fellow Rossgrey and Tipperary man, Brian. and to wish him well. And I suppose it's not a new post any longer, but recently incumbent into it, and to wish you every success in it. I know from the background that you come from that you're very committed and very able, and no doubt will make a success of the post. Just to start with, I mean, what we're debating, Gaeltacht, as you well know, and probably would remind me or draw my attention back to really what we're talking about is a proposed electoral commission and the establishment of that. And, you know, we've had a lot of good suggestions here this afternoon. But one of the things that's most important in the electoral system is confidence of the public. And, you know, while, you know, there are numerous faults and failings with the system we have at the moment, as has been articulated here today, one thing that when we do tamper with it is that we maintain the confidence or strengthen the confidence of the general public in it. And my question to the speakers here this afternoon is to know that the electoral commission, as is proposed, do they think that that will solve many of the issues that you have raised here, and is this the way forward? And just with the last speaker there, you know, talking about a person turning up at a polling station with their passport, I think it's very important that the people who are voting for people know the person, you know, that the candidates, that they know the candidates, that they know the problems and the issues within the area. And for example, if somebody was to walk into Roscrea from Timbuktu and say, I have a passport here and I wish to vote here, they don't know what the effect that's having on the local people, on the people of the county or of that area. So I think that, you know, it's not quite as simple as that. And like some of the issues that arose with previous presentations here that we asked was about education of the electorate. For example, somebody said at the last meeting that 20,000 spoiled votes in the last election. But on the opposite of that then is that, I mean, on a turnout, if you take an average turnout of around 70,000, I mean that 30,000 people, if they all were to vote, it could make a significant difference in it. So my question to be would, you know, is the Commission in a position to inspire, to have confidence in the public that they will solve all these matters? I mean, for example, do you think we should have compulsory voting, that everybody should have to vote? And the impact that it has. But my point is, and maybe the speakers address it, is that confidence in the electoral system, it is fairly high amongst the public at the moment. We need to maintain that, so we need to be very credible in what we do. And the other general point is that you think the Electoral Commission, as being proposed, is, you know, the proper way forward. And there was one other thing that might interest, particularly Brian, as he deals with it, you know, the diaspora. Again, you know, how they can be registered to vote, if they should be entitled to vote, and what I said originally about the effect that they may have on, you know, a constituency living away from it, and if they're aware of what's happening and the impact of the decision that they make will have on the general public.
Thank you, Deputy Conan. And Senator Keane.
Thank you. Just a question, and I'm sorry I was up at the Shannon on this paper here. Present participants were asked to how important particular issues might be to them. Now, they put their career, this is the youth, the career and education, obviously top, number ones. But areas such as voting, active involvement in politics, received mainly neutral or negative responses. Now, was there any follow-up done on that as to why? Because I'm only reading this, but I can guess why, and I've read a lot, and I have this report indeed as well. But on that, I do think, obviously, the youth are turned off, because I know I was in South Dublin County Council when the very first Corlin and Og and Dáil and Og was set up, and I think actually the name came from South Dublin County Council on my own proposal. Dáil and Og was first, and then Corlin and Og, and that's now, South Dublin County Council are very active, and they developed a toolkit to get the youth of the area involved, because there's no point in putting your name on a register if the people actually don't vote. That's where adults should be ashamed of themselves. The youth could teach the adults there, because when youth do register to vote, there is a 53% voting. They do turn out. The people, well, 53% of them in the last survey that I looked at turned out to vote. Now, on the issue of automatic registration, I know Hillary Clinton proposed that on June, just gone, for America. It's in one state in Oregon in America, automatically, people who reach 18 years of age, if they have a driving licence. I don't know why they brought in the driving licence into, because not everybody, loads of people can't drive, but they're, you know, they should be eligible to vote. But that's the way they did it. But it's a thing in this country, and we had it with the RSI numbers. ID and identification, and until we have a system that actually talks to the computers, that links everybody to the Who Are You facility that they have in New Zealand, you're not going to be able to, say, identify people, because you were talking about, and one of the senators here the last day spoke about a person being registered to vote and voting 12 times in an election. So, you know, that has to be safeguarded. We know how IT hackers are.
Senator Keane, without interruption. Thank you, Deputy.
Yeah, just on the voter household, you know, changing from automatic or from household to individualisation of voting. There was a survey done in the UK, and it was found, and I'm sure it would be the same, and I don't think any survey was done here, that 78% of the voters could transfer automatically. You wouldn't, with the touch of a button, you could be transferred over. But the only people that would lose out in that are the youth, who are renters and very often, you know, move, as you said yourself, move address frequently, the automatic transfer system from household. But there obviously has to be a way to be found, because it is the way, and I think most of the participants that we have listened to here over the last 4 weeks on the Commission has recommended that individualisation rather than household voting. In, I don't know what your participation subgroups, and you know, as I said, getting voting done. I can see local participation. We are saying about local authorities, and I said here, there's no point in throwing out the baby with the bathwater and centralising everything if the local authority is the best place to do something. Now, obviously, for registration, I had a person call to my house last night, would you believe, in Timpelogue from South Dublin County Council, asking how many people were on the register, and, you know, so somebody said they don't do it. They do it. Obviously, it's not there all the time, and maybe if they don't get it, whatever, it's not always very accurate, but they do it. And bulk forms are accepted in a lot of councils. Very often, some councils say, well, will you come in with the councillor or something, identify yourself and that type of thing. But that's another issue that has to be looked at, making it easy for people who want it now. But as I said, until we have a good quality data matching system, we're not at the races. And I absolutely think there should be online. Everybody's going online for everything. I said here the last day, we trust our banking with online, and then somebody said, no, we don't. But maybe the last people you should trust be the banking. But 64 million. But no, the online voting system, because really people, and I think it's a bit like the kidney donor system, an opt-out rather than an opt-in system for voting should be a way to look at it, and to focus really. And I think Mollanoga August Chuckishe Shineo.
We'll begin with Anne, perhaps, and work with
yeah, just with regard to the research, that's just one page where we pulled out some of the data from that study. It's a very, very big study. It's available on the Department of Children and Youth Affairs website. But really, like my presence here is really to comment on, if an electoral commission is established, that it needs to play its part in this national strategy, and it needs to listen to and get the views of children and young people under the age of 18, even though they're not yet of voting age, because if children and young people are not actively engaged in decision making, then when it comes to the time of their becoming adults, they don't feel a sense of engagement. And what I'm quite citing from is both from the research evidence and from the evidence that young people themselves, children and young people themselves say. They want to be involved in decision making. They want to be engaged. They want to be asked what they think. And there are so many ways in which that can be done at all ages, obviously appropriate to the age level that the child or young person is at. So that's really my point.
Thank you, Anne.
Yeah, sorry. Just in relation to Deputy Coonan, your point around people having trust in the electoral system at present, we would totally agree with that statement, except for the electoral register, and we would have a perception that people have trust in polling day and the result, but not necessarily in the process. You know, that people the electoral register process. Sorry. In terms of compulsory voting, that wouldn't be something that we'd be in favour of. And in terms of the number of people spoiling their ballots, I guess from their perspective, that is a message to the electoral, to the political system, and I mean that is to be, I guess, digested in whatever way you desire. But I mean that is something that people would use as a means of engaging with the system, even though it's not necessarily expressing a preference. In terms of the diaspora, we would support a vote for the diaspora in presidential elections. Now, we understand there are complexities and practicalities in relation to the Constitution and how that is done, but that is certainly something that we would support. Senator Keane, just in relation to your figure in terms of voter turnout, it's actually 62% at the last general election of young people versus a 70% average of all age cohorts. And just in terms of the validation of your identity online, Lotto.ie, for instance, are able to validate people's identities using submissions of passports and passport scans. So if a body like that is able to verify people's identification for the for that purpose, I guess, we should be able to kind of develop that process, and we do need to start that process somewhere. And that is something that is often put off in relation to databases and things like that. It's thought that, okay, that's too big a job, but actually we need to start engaging with that job, and I think that will be something the Electoral Commission can definitely do. And lastly, just in terms of your point about household surveys, at the moment, yes, that is one of the only ways that we can do the maintenance of the electoral register, but it's hugely costly, and not cost efficient. In terms of New Zealand, they spend 2/3 of their budget pretty much doing that. Whereas if we were able to have an online system where we could all maintain our records ourselves, and it was up to the individual to do so, I think it would be much more cost effective for the new body to be able to do that.
Thank you. Yep, Don.
Yeah, if I may. So there's a good few issues raised there. First thing about confidence in the electoral system, I'd very much echo what was just said, that obviously the people believe the results are very robust, but I personally, having a lot of experience with it, would have very low levels of confidence in how we put the register together. And obviously, words like tampering, I think there is a when you mention the word, when you say the word online in a sentence to do with voting, people think of e-voting and they immediately go, oh no. But I think online voting is very different to including the online option in the process leading up to voting. And in regard to multiple votes, I think that hurts confidence in the system as well. Someone said about compulsory voting. Call me a radical. I think that's a great idea. In Australia, you get fined $20 for not voting, and you can choose to spoil it if you want, but maybe that's a discussion for a different day. I think that's a cracking idea. And if nothing else, I think voter registration as opt-out makes infinite sense. Unfortunately, and there is a 2008 Geary Institute report that was done on this exact thing, and it did circle the drain and eventually come back to the need for an ID number, because there are issues with using PPS, there are issues with using driver's licenses, obviously, and they did raise issues of will that impinge on people's privacy? Are we ready for that step? I think that's a bit silly. I think taxes impinge on your privacy, lots of things impinge on your privacy, and having a centralised ID number is unfortunately something that would have to be considered very seriously. Those are my remarks.
No, thank you. Deputy McEntee.
Thank you, Gaeltacht, and thank you to our guests today and for your contributions. I suppose I don't have too many questions because I think a lot has been said, a lot has been answered, and we're here to have a general discussion. We've had quite a few interesting weeks and interesting comments. Firstly, just to congratulate Ms O'Donnell and the department on the strategy that they've launched. I do think it is fantastic. It's something I would wholeheartedly agree. I think young people, it's something that has surprised me more so since being elected, the amount of engagement. When you engage with young people, they engage back, not just secondary schools, but primary schools, whether they're up here in the Dáil with you or whether you're down in the schools. So I think it's very important to engage with them at a younger age, and I suppose it raises the whole question of lowering the voting age, if that's necessary, or whether we just need to start engaging at a younger age and leave the age at 18. So I suppose my first question, I know Mr Power has addressed it, but to all of you, where do you stand on that, on lowering the voting age? Do you think it needs to be looked at, or do you think that we just need to engage more so with younger people? I suppose I wouldn't disagree with a lot of what's been said today. Just to touch on something that my colleague has said, Mr Byrne, I note that in your submission you said that you would hope that the democratically positive experience of the high turnout seen in the May referendums would not act as a disincentive to enact much needed change. If anything, I think it has actually done the opposite. You had a Carlow-Kilkenny by-election that happened at the same time, and the number of spoiled votes was 3 or 4% higher than you would normally have in a local or general election. So while there are problems with registrations, the people who made the effort to register and come home and were actually in the voting booth voted for one and not the other. So there's a more serious question that needs to be answered there. Why did, they had gone to the trouble of coming home and actually voting on one, but they didn't vote on the other. So I suppose that leads to the whole question of education and, again, engagement. And what are your views on that? We touched on that last week with one of our guests, Mr Liam Weeks, and he feels that obviously education is key. Personally, I think if young people are saying that politicians are not engaging with them, then we're the ones that need to be educated, and perhaps we should start engaging more. But just if I could get your views on those. Thank you.
Who wants to kick off?
Yeah, sure. Our position really is that we should lower the voting age to 16. Voting is somewhat of a gateway drug. Once you vote once, you tend to vote every time afterwards. It tends to be a process which you engage with and then you follow through the rest of your life. It's not something that you tend to stop afterwards. If you're engaged young, that is. And secondly, from research, I think it's Eurostat research, the reasons why young people don't vote is because of a couple of different issues. The number one issue is because they're not registered, so we've discussed that at length. And number two is because they don't feel that politicians or politics engages with them and their issues. And I think that's something that you rightly point out. Young people, when they are engaged with, engage back. And I think it is up to us, both as adults and as politicians, to engage with young people and trying to bring them into the political process. Education is key, but actually we all know that experiential learning is much more effective than anything else. And I think that certainly, if politicians were seen to be speaking to the issues relevant to young people and following up on them and acting, I think that's something that young people can definitely see through, is they can see through hollow kind of statements and gestures. And we had a consultation at the weekend, and there was a particular issue where there was one speaker who was quite condescending, or kind of, it was quite clear that they were there for validation purposes and not for anything else. And they'll see through it straight away. So it needs to be a meaningful engagement with young people. And from our perspective, in terms of education, it should be that the Electoral Commission itself is not going to be able to do that work. It's going to need to set up funds for organisations that work with young people to be able to do that type of education piece. So they need to be able to put together strategies that are going to engage young people with the electoral system and with the political system, and have organisations that are on the ground engaged with young people already do those and deliver those, because that makes most sense, and it's going to be the most effective thing and the best way to spend taxpayers' money in that regard.
Anybody else comment on that?
So you mentioned a part of my document. So I think in that section I said, obviously it needs to act as an incentive rather than a disincentive, these fantastic images of the last few months. I think a big question, with the spoiled votes, you ask why do people do that? I think a big thing is as I've already said, with marriage referendum, it was very binary. It was very simple. Do you want gay people to be able to marry or not? And I think if there was some kind of greater effort or resource established whereby it's like Carlow-Kilkenny by-election, vote for this person. Did you know this person has this stance on this and this and this, and this person has this stance on this and this, and this person will do this? There would be a greater cause and effect. There would be a clearer cause and effect relationship in your vote for a party over one party over another. So the question, as Deputy Stanley said before he left, I think would be if there was some kind of resource available to clarifying what voting for one person versus voting for another person actually entails, it would go some way to the clear relationship in the marriage referendum that I think led to the brilliant turnout.
Point on that in relation to education, as Ms O'Donnell pointed out earlier, every single decision that is made, there isn't any piece of legislation that doesn't affect a young person. So in relation to education, it's how do you educate young people to the fact that the person that you are electing would be making decisions that will affect you. You mightn't think it will, but they will, and they're just, it's closing that gap and joining the dots to show younger people, and I suppose that comes about from engagement.
Brian?
I think there's an important kind of crossover as well to a certain extent with people from a migrant background as well about what's relevant, and sometimes the perception is that people from a migrant background only vote on issues that are relevant to migrants or are only interested in things like that, and I think that is absolutely not the case. You know, everybody that's living in Ireland has kids in school, they're involved in local communities, they're involved in kind of all those issues as well. So when we're talking about both kind of confidence in the voting system and also how to make it most relevant, it is about kind of reaching out and as you say, if you talk to people and you engage with them, they will tell you back what they're interested in, and you'll find that there's a broad unanimity of kind of interest there. And from